Hello and welcome to the CyberScotland podcast. My name's Mike Smith and I'm the Incident Response and Threat Intelligence Manager at the Cyber and Fraud Centre. So this podcast links in with the previous Incident Response podcast we did a few weeks ago, still once again on the topic of incident response. However, today we're going to be discussing a cyber incident, how it played out, this time from a victim's perspective. So we'll be discussing indicators that led up to the incident, talking through the incident as it progressed, possibly going over some of the days and weeks as it panned out. Today I'm joined by Lyndsey Jackson, who's the Deputy Chief Executive at the Edinburgh Fringe Society. So Lyndsey, first of all, thank you for joining me today. I know it must be hard to probably go over some of the incident, so really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us today.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
So before we delve into the actual incident and the technicalities, could you just give me a bit of background into your organisation, first of all?
Yeah, so I work for the Edinburgh Festival Fringe Society, and we are the charity that underpins the infrastructure of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. For those of you that don't know what the Edinburgh Fringe is, it is the largest arts event on the planet. It's a multidisciplinary arts festival that takes place every August in Edinburgh for 3 weeks. It's a truly magical and wonderful event, and you should all come.
Agree with that, yeah.
Get my plugs in early.
Yeah, see, I'm just thinking about the dates. We're just discussing when this took place. I mean, were you in a state of change prior to this happening? Had you made changes? There was obviously people working from home. The workforce was reduced somewhat, or were there... We know we'd moved to a sort of electronic period at that time. Was there change prior to this? Were you working differently?
Yeah, we had been working differently. So this happened to us in January 2021. So by that point, we were, a year into COVID and really trying to understand. We'd shifted how we'd work remotely. And in fact, some of the things that we'd done pre-COVID and during COVID to move into a more remote environment actually helped us in the long run in terms of being in the cloud and not being dependent upon server architectures. So things had started to shift already. And this came at a point when there was still quite a lot of uncertainty about that year's festival, but we were in operational planning, ready to deliver mode, but thankfully not quite middle of August mode.
No. So you're right. So you were moving forward though, and it was plans to put that event on that year.
Mm-hmm.
So prior to the incident, did you have any indication that anything was wrong? Did you have a few weeks before? Was there anything, or were there computers offline, or things working slowly, or just anything at all?
No, not that we were aware of at the time. I think it was a very much a surprise to us to come to work and find that our files were inaccessible to us. So we hadn't seen any unusual behaviours that would have indicated that something was going on behind the scenes.
And that's it. It was as black and white as that, turn up and no access.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so in relation to that, the incident, can you just describe how it played out? And, well, in fact, how did you feel when you heard about it?
Oh, it was a fun day. So some of the team arrived at their desks, either in person or remotely, to find that everything on our shared network drives was inaccessible to them and had been replaced with a README text file. I got a call from our IT team, who are partly internal and partly a third-party supplier, sort of indicating that maybe something had happened and they were investigating. And it sort of snowballed from there. So at the start, it was like, oh, okay, things happen. You're just expecting it to be one of those run-of-the-mill things. And then within sort of an hour and a half, it was really clear that it was quite serious, and that they managed to infiltrate the whole system. So at that point, everybody stopped doing whatever they were doing and focused their attention on trying to understand A, what was happening to us, and B, what we needed to do. I don't think we knew quite what was happening to us, but we all knew it was pretty serious and that it required a pretty all hands on deck immediate response.
Yeah, and you mentioned there that there's a message on the staff screen. So I mean that was the staff at that point knew what was going on. It wasn't like you could deal with this at an executive level, but everyone knew from the start then.
Yeah, it was the impacts, I suppose, sort of jumping about a little bit. The things that weren't impacted were very much externally focused, like ticketing, registration, mailing, marketing, all of those sorts of things. They were very well protected from this. But the main impact of this attack on us was on our operational files. So we were moving into the Office 365 environment, but we still had a sort of legacy physical server. So all staff trying to log into the VPN, all staff trying to work at home and get into files that weren't in those cloud-based systems were like, nope, you can't go anywhere.
Yep.
And of course, the first thing we did was sort of switch everything off because we didn't want it to get any worse than it already was. So the initial instinct, which was right now, let's just start turning things off. That got pretty that got pretty urgent pretty quickly.
How far into the transition from legacy to cloud were you? I mean, did you have access to part of the stuff you were needing to continue working? Or
so largely the teams had done a great job of moving operational files for the previous year and the year that we were in to Teams and SharePoint and all that Microsoft product. So a lot of that was quite accessible. I'd say we were probably about 3/4 away through the current operational, and we hadn't really started to think about how we might transfer over archive and legacy and historical data. So we'd made quite a lot of progress in the day-to-day running of the charity, not being on a server in our server room, but hadn't done a lot about the legacy, and were in the late stages of a transfer of our finance and payroll files, but the timing of the financial year end meant that hadn't been done. So that was quite a big impact to us to lose that A, that information, and B, to lose access at that point with things like our audit, etc. It made all of that much more complicated.
Yeah, you were saying there that you then went, listen, shut down, we don't want this spreading. I mean, was that the reaction in relation to, well, the decision-making process, let's close down? In fact, I suppose, did you have a plan?
We had a sort of plan. As a company, as an organisation responsible for this major event, we had a series of incident management plans that did include things like what if we were unable to access our servers, but they were largely, there's a fire, or the police shut the road, or there's a massive power outage. Edinburgh's power can be unreliable. We hadn't really done much in the way of thinking about this, and we'd always focus that on, the service to the customer. So can you register your show? Can you buy a ticket? Yeah. Can you engage with the Fringe Society? We've done less work internally, but the instinct was that there was clearly malware in there, and to switch off all of the affected servers was the first instinct, and then that had knock-on effects like, our phone lines were on voice over IP, so they suddenly vanished, and so then the IT team focused on putting fixes in place of the things that we'd switched off, while we focused on trying to understand what was going on and what we might do about it.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the public and the ticketing. Well, in fact, a minute ago you mentioned the payroll, etc. Was the public side still up and running, or was that down for a period as well?
No, there was no interruption to anything publicly facing. I think maybe our phone lines weren't operational for about an hour. As an organisation who process a huge amount of financial transactions, and obviously our primary purpose is to help artists and audiences register their shows and buy tickets, we'd done a quite sophisticated amount of work in protecting those and ring-fencing those. So we had considered cyber resilience and cyber security in those areas. So thankfully, none of that externally, you wouldn't have known this was happening. Yeah,
I think I remember at the time, and also I read online recently that you did have good segregation in place. Your systems were fairly well set up in terms of preparing for this attack.
Yeah, we'd done a lot of work around, obviously we have to be compliant with payment card industry standards, and we have to be compliant with GDPR. So we've done an awful lot of work around making sure that where other people's sensitive information might be held, that they weren't vulnerable. We just not finished that work on our own files and our own systems that help us with the operations of the charity.
Yeah. What about internal communications? Were they impacted at all, or when decisions were getting made by you and your team, how were they relayed down the way?
Internally, it was good. We had to figure out how to make sure everybody can access their emails. And actually, one of the things when we got our incident response company on board 3 or 4 days later, the one server we hadn't shut down was the domain controller, because it was the only thing that we had to control email. So that was where their expertise came in, because they allowed us to be able to switch that off but maintain email correspondence. So actually it was good, even though everybody was working at home. In the first instance, I think 2 days after it happened, we pulled everyone together to sort of tell them what was going on. We'd sent them all an email explaining that there'd be disruption and that this was happening. And then we just kept them up to date. And one of the reasons that we kept them up to date is the most sensitive data on those files that could have been subject to a data breach was their data as employees. So that was really important that they understood what we were doing and why and what was happening to us as an organisation.
Oh, you just went in there, mentioned after a couple of days that you had, you were having meetings and you were relaying information to them. One of the questions I was going to say, well, what were the timescales involved in this? How did it play out in terms of incident to incident response company to, just moving forward? I mean, how long do you think it got to recovery?
It was, as I think most crises are, it was incredibly quick and then incredibly slow. So incident reported at sort of, 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. We've talked to the ICO, we've talked to NCSC, we've talked to Scottish Business Resilience Centre, we've talked to the police. By the sort of, Tuesday afternoon, we've got an incident response company on board by that weekend who'd come through our insurers. And then the sort of 2 weeks after that were a sort of constant stream of late nights, early mornings, weekends, while the incident response company sort of sought to get a handle on it and get it under control as quickly as possible and make us back to operation as quickly as possible. And then everything slowed down inevitably because that's when, people need to go off and do deeper detailed work. So I think we finally, if this happened in January 2022, not 2021, as I said earlier, then I think the ICO sort of drew a line underneath it in September 2022, same with Oscar. So it was quite a long time, but it did have that initial first month where it was every single hour because time was really critical, and the incident response company were quite keen to sort of get stuff resolved as quickly as possible. The recovery and the restoration took a little bit longer. I mean,
I've got a question about the incident response. I obviously touched on this with David from NCC when we did the first podcast. I mean, can you just give us an idea? In fact, you mentioned there that this was allocated, the incident response kit was allocated through your insurance company. That was one of the chats we had. It was, do you have a retainer? But you obviously had cyber insurance where they were you probably had legal representation allocated as well. How did that go?
So the conversation with our insurer, we did have cyber recovery insurance, not very much, but a little bit. But actually, the insurer said we could use whoever we wanted to, but we had no idea what we were looking for. This had never happened to us before. So we went with their recommendations, and it also helped at the other end because they have existing relationships, which meant tidying up that insurance claim was easier. And then it was just trust. So we had a very early Saturday morning call with both companies who'd worked together, both the legal, we used CyberClan and RSC, CyberClan for the incident response and RSC for the legal advice. They'd worked together a lot before. So, that was a very early Saturday morning call that went on for most of Saturday, and they were incredible. Like, I know this is their job, but it was just, when you're in a position of crisis, you need people that can clearly articulate what they're going to do and why they're going to do it and how they're going to help and manage your expectations and do it in a way that accepts that you've no idea what you're talking about some of the time. So they were brilliant both in the technical support, in their knowledge and their experience, but also in their advice, in their sort of willingness for us to be like, we don't know what that means. And they were like, well, let's have a screen share and we'll talk you through it. They are the only incident response company that I've ever worked with. But it was at a point of crisis to put yourself in the hands of experts who really do care about what they're doing and aren't particularly egotistical about who knows what and who doesn't know what. It was all very sort of like, let's solve this problem. So as weird as it is to say, they were a great team to work with, and they had a good sense of humour, and they were just interesting people, and the legal advice was solid and reasonable and appropriate, and it was a really positive experience actually.
Right, well, I mean, from an insurance side, you can't say any more than that then, I think it boils down to trust, I suppose, in relationships, doesn't it? It sounds like that was there from the start.
It really was.
So jumping back slightly in relation to cybersecurity and the organisation, was this something that you provided training in relation to? Was it something that was discussed? I'm thinking more at executive level. Was this on your radar at all?
It was, and I think in retrospect, we were a little naive because I think we thought we'd done the work that needed to be done in the event of a loss of information and a loss of data. I don't think what we've done is specifically focus on something like a ransomware or a malware or a cyber attack. So, when you talk about being in a major event, it's quite often that people have to consider whether or not you're subject to that sort of nefarious action where people would seek to take you out. What I think the most surprising thing about this was just how ordinary it seems to be. And I don't even think it was about us as an organisation. So we were naive in thinking that we might be the subject of something like this. Because who would want to attack the Fringe? And it doesn't actually matter whether or not we're the Fringe. We're just the charity that they found a vulnerability with and attempted to exploit that vulnerability. So, and
were there any negotiations? Did you make contact with the people that had hacked you at all, or did your IR company?
No, they asked us if we wanted to. We had both README files and sort of direct email ransom. And to be honest, it didn't really even cross our minds. And the police's advice is obviously, if you negotiate with them, then you're funding them to do this further. But as a charity responsible for other people's money, I think it would be really weird for us to then be like, okay, we're going to fund cyber terrorism. So we didn't even really cross our minds at an executive or a board level that we would pay the ransom.
Right. Okay. No, I'm just wondering, I mean, obviously you've got the insurance company there and you're kind of being guided by your legal team and by your IR company. And I know you said that the police said, don't go funding organised crime, etc. But sometimes there may be a different angle. There may, it's all depending on what your guidance is at the time.
Yeah, there's something really, what was quite interesting about it, particularly, I guess, for a charity or a third sector organisation, is the legal advice was really clear that for some companies, they just want this dealt with and put away. And I think the police were quite clear on that you don't have to report these things as a crime, and you don't have to support trying to understand how people do this. But from our point of view, we were so grateful to the signposting that was done to us of other companies that had been this. So the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency obviously had a major incident and it cost them hundreds of thousands of pounds. Being able to have read their incident and learn from that and understand and take guidance from how they were articulating things. And then the chair of our board and our board more broadly were very clear that this would not be a secret, that we would be really clear and straightforward. We would keep a good, clear action of log of what we'd done and why, and we'd be fairly over about it and its impacts, because we've been the victim of a crime.
Yeah.
So and within that, if we can help others like us not find themselves in this position, then we should do that, which is why I'm here talking to you. Because if other people can learn from our stupid mistakes, then I wouldn't wish this on anybody.
No.
So if we can help.
So in terms of the hack itself, or in terms of the data that was encrypted in the first, did it appear online at all, or was there any? Obviously, there was staff. You said there was staff data, etc. Do you know if that posted anywhere, or was it just the ransom note that you had to deal with, the ransom that you had to deal with?
So CyberScotland did a huge amount of work on trying to understand the flow of information and the transfer of data. So they were very clearly able to evidence the point at which encryption took place, but were not able to evidence any sort of data transfer back out. None of that data ever appeared on the dark web or on any, various agencies set up searches against certain keywords. I think we were if it's possible to be fortunate in such a circumstance, in that this coincided with the start of the war in Ukraine. So there was a sort of element of the cybercrime community within Russia and Ukraine and actors acting amongst themselves in a sort of, so I think none of it ever became public, and
right.
We were able to say with reasonable certainty that data was never actually extracted. It was only encrypted.
Right. So there was and then did you say there was a shift in direction essentially with the changes in Ukraine, etc. So I'm going to use that word hindsight here, which it's not always fair. But is there anything you would have done differently? In fact, listening to you now, it sounds like in terms of a ransom incident, it actually played out quite well. You had good segregation on your systems, your IR company, your representation was excellent. But is there anything you would have done or you could have done differently since you've reviewed? I mean, since you've reviewed things.
Yeah, definitely. I think some of our points of failure in this process are we should have done more around multi-factor authentication on things like your logins to Teams and VPNs and various other things. The security on them was good, but could have been better. We sort of didn't want to inconvenience people in an already inconvenient time, but actually, since we've introduced it, it hasn't been that much of an inconvenience, and people have got good hygiene factors around that. We definitely should have tested both our backups and our tape and our cloud-based backups, because both of them failed, which means the files that were encrypted are completely lost to us. We've not been able to restore any of those, which is largely sort of archive and historical information. So we had never got to the point of testing a roll down of that or testing those tapes effectively, and that was a schoolboy error.
Yeah.
If you're going to make backups, you should definitely test your backups.
Were they encrypted or just not usable?
So the cloud backup had backed up the encrypted files, and the tape backup, the tapes were just corrupted and unreadable. So we sent them off to a company and they were like, no, these tapes are old right. and bad and you shouldn't have used them. So lots of lessons learned there. But I think looking back on it, we dealt with it in the best way possible, I think, and relied very heavily on that expert advice that we got from CyberClan and RPC, just to try and understand, they'd done this, they do this for a living. So they were able to help us work our way through it. And then we had great support from Police Scotland and the NCSC because of the scale of the event and who we are. They had concerns about, any of our information becoming public. So I think we did the right thing in sort of going, this is happening to us, please help, rather than trying to hide away in a corner and pretend it wasn't happening.
I mean, I was going to say, have you got any recommendations for anyone else? I mean, you've kind of hit them, 2FA, two-step verification, double check your back, get the basics right in terms of, well, certainly logins, etc., or VPN login, etc. So, anything else from anyone, for any other businesses that you would advise?
My main advice would be to assume that it's a when you will be cyber attacked, not if, because it seems very much to me, at least, that it doesn't really matter who you are, what scale you are. If there's a vulnerability to be exposed on a massive scale, then that will happen. You don't need to be a major event with a major profile and lots of money. There's an arbitrariness to this whole process that really shocked and surprised me. After this happened to us, I was sort of seeing it everywhere. It was us, it was KP Nuts, it was it was Royal Mail. Like, these are big organisations, but there's loads of little guys. So being prepared for this to happen to you and knowing what you would do or what you can do to prevent it will make your life a lot easier, rather than it just being a terrifying surprise that you then have to deal with, because nobody likes terrifying surprises.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
I spoke in the last podcast about having a plan. And you've obviously talked about, since, you have taken steps to make some changes in terms of the technical side, your backups, your two-factor authentication, etc. What about in terms of planning, etc., in relation to like playbooks or an incident response plan? Have you developed, has that become more robust?
Yeah, that's evolving. So what it has done is it's accelerated our move to a cloud-based system. So, the servers in our server room are no longer ours, and it's all managed by other people, and it doesn't rely on a human being to spot a blinking light. It relies on a big system to do that. And then the next step is, where are there still potential vulnerabilities? But in making that future plan, making partnerships or taking contracts out with very reliable and very resilient providers. And certainly in the first year or two, sort of over monitoring and over protecting our systems, because once bitten, twice shy. So it has evolved our planning, but what it's done is it's evolved our planning to take out that responsibility for us and to contract in that responsibility from somebody else, which actually is no more expensive, which is another issue. It's no more expensive than the cost of what we were running before. The cost barrier.
Cost the hardware, yeah.
Yeah, the cost barrier for us was always the transition, and this forced the transition, and we had no choice but to find the money to do that. But actually, the running and the operational costs are as reasonable and as effective as they were before. So if you can find the money to make the jump, then once you make the jump, it won't cost you more. In fact, it probably costs you less.
And what about testing these plans? Have you got any idea or any plans for running days or testing out your systems and what it is, what changes you've got? Essentially exercising what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, every year we tabletop the Fringe and run through various scenarios. A building falls down, a terrible media scandal, and I think this thread will come into that a little more.
Not that you want to relive it again, but
no. But it is useful to interrogate and to check. And the other thing that we've been able to do is SBRC, who have a different name now,
Cyber and Fraud Centre Scotland.
Thank you, Cyber and Fraud Centre Scotland, do offer to third sector organisations a sort of vulnerability penetration testing service as a way. So we've enrolled in that, which I think will help us identify if there's any holes in our plan and there's any holes in our structure. So it'll be a mix of us working tabletop testing scenarios, but also allowing skilled good people to try and break their way in and see if there's any vulnerabilities remaining. So I'll keep you updated on that.
Yeah, brilliant. Right, Lyndsey, I really want to thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. As I said earlier, it must be, I've got tough here, it must be absolutely horrible having to relive some of the stuff that you went through, the processes, the pain, etc. So I'm hoping that some of the content we've covered today will help organisations and listeners out there. I'll finally add that if you are looking for information and resources on incident response, you can go to CyberScotland.com and follow the links to incident response. You'll find resources for putting plans together, emergency contacts, communications plans, all in pack, and also playbooks as well. So you can download them at CyberScotland.com. Lastly, once again, thank you for listening to the Cyber Scotland podcast on incident response. Thank you again, Lindsey, for taking part in this, and bye for now.